Good evening, St. Lucia, once again. Welcome to Head to Head. And tonight, for me, it is very special because we have a well-known lawyer in this house with us. In this house, I said, remember. And I hold him in really high esteem. I also say to you in the diaspora, I hope you're listening and that it's important. As I said, a well-renowned guest. It is someone I regard highly and have the greatest admiration for. He attended Monchy Combined. Could you believe that? Went on to A-level, then to the University of the West Indies in Barbados, then went on to Normal Manley School in Jamaica, and has been in his profession for many years, here and overseas. He's well respected and thought of highly. Well, I do, and I know a lot who do. So without even further ado, I want to present to you one of our best lawyers, Alberton Richelieu. Good evening, my friend.
Yes, good evening. Yes.
Welcome to Head to Head.
Thank you.
Boy, you know, I was trying my best to get you on, and finally we have. The discussion must be in that sphere, and I want to really look at the idea of human rights, the idea of the rule of law, and to look at, to an extent, our Constitution. Do we need to change this? Because, as you know, it is from the so-called Mandarins in Whitehall, not Westminster, as they keep saying. It's Whitehall. So, my first question to you is and it's close to my heart, and that is constitutional reform. Do you think that the time has come when we can get away from a constitutional reform that has been too much on a colonial system, and that the people of St. Lucia need to have a voice in that constitution?
Oh, I certainly do agree with that. As a matter of fact, let me start by saying one of the problems I've always thrashed out in my mind is that, and in fact, that was discussed when I was at university with Dr. Ralph Gonzalez, who at the time was my political science lecturer.
Wow.
And one of the difficulties that I've seen here in particular is that there is need for constitutional reform. If I may put it this way, I think that the colonial system which we imported into the different islands in the Caribbean appears to have betrayed us. Yes. It to my mind, appeared to have betrayed us because if you observe, from the time of independence, we usually have what is called a recurring decimal. A recurring decimal in the sense that we have a 5-year span to allow people to govern. And just observe it. Except for 1997 to most probably 2006, and 2006 to 2011, 2011 to 2016, you'd observe that every time a particular so-called political party takes up governance in this country, one of the difficulties that you'd see is that people get very tired of them within a very short space of time. For instance, if we looked at 2011, we realized that the Labour Party came back into power after the UWP had won in the 2006. The 2006 elections, to my mind, was very significant in that you'd realize that by that time it appears that at the time Prime Minister John Compton thought that the people were tired of the Labour Party. Come 2011, the people seem to have been tired with the UWP. Come 2016, they seem to have been tired of the Labour Party. And in my mind, I think that this does not augur well for economic development and progression and progressiveness in a country. Correct. There ought to be a more kind of stabilized system in order to be able to assist us to progress. What is even worse about it is that on every occasion you'd find that I am not saying that one may be good, one may be bad, but there must be good in something bad, in the sense that you find, for instance, there may be very beneficial programs advanced by one particular party. And by the time they come into office, for some reason or the other, oh, I'm just going to finish with that and continue with another. To my mind, I don't think that it really assists us. I compare that, for instance, with the American system. And why I use the American system is because, of course, the Americans themselves were colonized by different countries, the English, the Spanish, and so on. But when they gained their independence in 1776, they actually went on to develop their own political system. And so therefore, that is what is important. In St. Lucia, for instance, like you call it the Mandarin, and of course a lot of people has this misconception about the Westminster model.
Yes.
Is that at the end of the day, when the constitutional reform issue arose, a lot of ministers and so-called prime ministers thought that too much power was going to be taken away from them.
Exactly.
And it reminds me so much of what Dr. Ralph Gonzalez, when lecturing me, actually said. He said that Forbes Burnham, when he was the prime minister of Guyana, British Guyana at the time, said any prime minister in the Westminster model, that's what he called it, the Westminster model, who loses an election is a fool. And so therefore we asked the question. And I remember when I went back to St. Vincent and I spoke to Ralph Gonzalez about it, he just laughed. And he said, that is the way I found it and that is the way it'll have to continue. But I said, but you are the one who lectured me and told me otherwise. So I think that it is important that we need to have a sort of a constitutional reform in order to be able to assist us. We need, because let us take for example, fundamental rights and freedoms in this country.
Good. Yes.
What we are talking about.
Yes.
One will observe that if we have to take the historical development of our constitution, it actually came from the English position.
Yes, correct.
Now,
correct.
What we do not realize is that, for instance, in England, when the House of Commons passes laws, the House of Commons is what is called parliamentary sovereignty. In the Caribbean, it was transformed and translated into what is called constitutional sovereignty. But the basic concepts of parliamentary sovereignty still continues here, and I'll explain why. When you look at the fundamental rights and freedoms under each and every subset or subsection of the fundamental rights and freedoms, you will notice that it will tell you the right to liberty is supreme, the right to freedom, right to association. But in a subsection of the Constitution, they go on to tell us if any law is passed which is inconsistent with the Constitution, then it goes on section 48 of the Constitution to say if it is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. So one asks themselves, what is that elusive concept about being reasonably justifiable in a democratic society? And I will give two instances. If you may have observed, I was on a show some time ago in which I looked at the COVID-19 control bill. I am sure that there must have been much criticism when I said that there were aspects of that law which seemed to have been either sufficient safeguards were not put into it in order to buttress the fundamental rights and freedoms. And I may have been criticized for that. But it is not a question of criticism. It's a question of me being a lawyer, and the oath that I took gives me that leeway to say, look, there are areas of this thing which is weak and ought to be strengthened. But I may be criticized as being a Labour Party supporter for that. However, I want to remind St. Lucians, similarly, between 2011 and 2016, I also criticized a piece of legislation called Backing of Warrants Act. At that time, it was under the Labour government administration. And as far as I was concerned, at the time, I'm not all right, but at least I was able to ensure to see that at least there was an element of participatory democracy.
Correct.
Meaning
Correct.
that we already had an extradition act. The French at the time refused to have a treaty with St. Lucia because they did not believe in extraditing their own nationals. And I fought along that line. So to me, it does not matter. My position is that I try to be as objective as possible.
Correct.
And try to bring the message to the people when I realize that there's a particular... So constitutional reform, in my view, is fundamentally important, especially in relation to fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, one would observe that the English have not remained where they are. They have moved on. They have been dynamic. They have not remained static at all. Because why did they come into... Why did they bring in what is called the Convention of Rights in the European Union, for instance? And you'll hear them talking about the Articles 8 of the thing where particular rights and so on are likely to be violated and all these things. But what is more important for me when it comes to the constitutional aspect and, of course, the passing of laws, I would like to see a clause in a particular constitution which asks for for allowing the populace to be more involved in the decision-making process. That is important because it does not, in my view, and even recently, most controversial was the COVID-19 bill.
Yes, and we'll come to that, yes.
And one of the things I try to point out is that there is a Jamaican case called Robinson and the Attorney General, which was a decision given sometime this year in 2020 regarding the registration and Registration of Voters Act or something like that. And the judge actually quoted a learned legal commentator from Australia who indicated that dissension is part and parcel of the democratic process.
Indeed, indeed.
So, because a person dissents, it does not necessarily mean that he's against you. It may very well mean that he's trying to ensure that you do for the better to safeguard the interests of the persons whom you govern. And so, therefore, it is a fundamental part of the governance of any country to ensure that the populace and the majority, because that is all what democracy is about. Democracy is for the people, by the people.
By the people, correct.
You know.
So the people have to be involved.
The people must be involved in what is going on.
Yes.
And I suppose it does not matter which parties in power. It is one aspect of society which they must take into consideration when they're considering the question of passing laws, because these things are important.
Yes.
It impinges on people's livelihood.
Exactly.
It impinges, and I pointed out a number of examples. For example, in the COVID-19 Act, the same way I pointed a number of misgivings about the Backing of Warrants Act. Now, you know what happens? What troubles me? That despite dissension, everybody will say, well, let us consider it. Okay, we'll see if we could give it consultation and so on. But you know what happens? After the time has passed, everybody forgets about it and it just stays lying on the books.
Exactly.
And so therefore we do absolutely nothing about it. And I think that, and you know what it really bothers me sometimes. And I looked at, for instance, Madam Justice Susie Dovey, who's a lady who I was very close to as a friend and so on.
I knew you very well too.
Yes. And I remember that she undertook this whole process of constitutional reform. I knew that she took quite a long time because sometimes I used to go and visit her.
4 years.
Almost 4 years.
Yes.
And what happened to it when it got to Parliament? They dished it.
Both sides.
Both sides, which is troubling.
Exactly.
It is troubling. Both sides. Why? Because it is thought that the kind of powers which were vested in those different prime ministers and ministers would not be able to hold water in a constitutional reform, which is not for the benefit of the ministers. It's supposed to be for the benefit of the people.
The country.
The country as a whole.
As a whole.
And that is why that I always say to people that my position is being objective.
Correct.
But you see, people do not understand objectivity and fairness. Any time that you're being objective and fair, then it means that you are part and parcel of a particular part of the political tribalism.
But isn't that, because we're coming to our first break, but isn't that, and I'm going to come back to that, but isn't that what I would call the idea of, say, for example, it's embedded in us from the so-called colonials?
That is the point. That is the point. And I have made that point time and again.
Let me hold you there, because we'll come back. We are onto our first segment, and we will come back immediately on that in the second segment. So you in the diaspora and in St. Lucia, hold on, because this is a very, very important discussion for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people. Welcome back to Head to Head. With me in the studio tonight is someone that I regard very highly, Mr. Alberton Richelieu, and we are discussing, to an extent, constitutional reform. And I say it, and I will continue to say it, because a lot of people here tend to think that our constitution was made for us not in the so-called higher echelon of British society, but really in what we term Whitehall by Mandarins. And consequently, the Constitution, as far as I'm concerned, what we have here, was made for them, not for us. But we have become independent, yet we still have a Constitution that favors England when we are an independent country. This must change. It must be a Constitution of the people of St. Lucia. So, Alberton, as we were saying,
yes, as I was saying, one of the things I remember asking a particular doctor one time, whether or not the issue of what West Indians suffered could have a deeper, a sort of effect or filtering effect in our DNA. And he said to me that it is possible. Suppression, oppression, and repression
Correct.
Can certainly have that kind of effect. Because one of the things that I have observed, and one would observe that at least Barbados seemed to be moving away from this whole line, and Barbados seemed to be moving towards a republic. And it is rather surprising, other than Trinidad and Guyana, that has gone the Republican way, and of course Dominica. Mm-hmm. The thing about it is that one would have thought that Barbados would have been the last to get there.
Correct, because they're so British.
Not only that, they call themselves Little England.
Little England. Yes.
And you know, I mean, when we look at a lot of colonialism, let us say, for instance, we look at going to the Privy Council.
Correct, yes.
One of the things that I have realized is that in the Caribbean, we have the Caribbean constitutions, which speaks about the independence of the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. But a contradiction in terms arise when, for instance, we appeal to the Privy Council, and the Privy Council, after giving their decision, says, well, either the appeal is dismissed or the appeal is allowed, and we would therefore have to advise the Queen accordingly. Yes.
I mean, unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Yes.
So we're asking ourselves, is the whole concept of the independence of the respective bodies a pseudo concept?
Exactly.
Meaning, is it real?
It is. Well, I agree with you.
And even that in itself, and you know, we have the tendency to believe up until this time now, and this brings up a serious debate in relation to the issue of colonialism.
Yep.
And I brought up the Privy Council to bring up this fundamental point. Let us look at, for instance, we are now trying to establish the Caribbean Court of Justice.
Correct.
there are a number of Caribbean countries that have followed, that have decided to delink themselves from the Privy Council but join the CCJ.
Yes.
Those who have not joined the CCJ for now, you think that we do not have judges who are just as good as the judges in the Privy Council?
I know.
But the question arises, why is that skepticism? Is it that we do not trust ourselves? Is it that the colonial powers have embedded in us, in our DNA, so much that we cannot trust our own people? You understand? So these are the issues that I'm looking at. And what's even more telling is that the very same Barbados we were talking about was one of the first to have joined the CCJ.
Exactly.
And we talk about the possibility of political interference and so on. I mean, that is a reality. But is it a reality? Is it a reality that we were made to believe? Or is it real?
But no, but Alberton, to be honest with you, when we talk about this colonialism, just look at the Constitution itself. In England, where there is no constitution,
no written constitution,
they say that the Prime Minister is ultra vires.
Yeah.
He can call an election at any time. Our Prime Minister can, but it has to go first to the Governor General.
Yeah.
And is it not that it was the way the Constitution was formed was they thought that they would always have a white Governor General.
That is what happened.
And consequently, that was embedded in us.
That is what has happened.
That we'll always have. And this is where fundamentally you listen to children that says, I'm fairer than you.
Yes.
That is embedded. It's like in Haiti, old Haiti, the mulatto didn't mix with the so-called darker people. And hence, when Toussaint Louverture had his revolution, he never had a mulatto around him. You get what I'm saying? They did it quietly. Yet the mulattoes, when they wanted, before Toussaint, didn't want no blacks around them.
At all. But you see,
it is embedded.
But you see, what I have come to the conclusion, sometimes I even wonder in my mind that whether or not we have what you call a pigmentocratic society.
Yes, we do.
A pigmentocratic society in the sense that, the fair skin and so on always provides the better circumstances.
I hate to say it, we are seeing it right now.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I remember listening to was it? I'm trying to recall if it was Sandy Ford in Barbados, or one of them in Barbados at the time, when you had people like Tom Adams.
Yes.
And he called them Negrocrats. And they asked, and when that happened, of course, the Bajans who are always ready to run into the dictionary, unlike us, because we do not read.
Exactly.
In St. Lucia, we don't read, period.
Quite.
And Negrocrats, and he was wondering, and they said that they never saw that word in the dictionary. And he said, you know what happened? It is the Negro who thinks he has taken the place of the white man.
I'm telling you.
That is where the difficulty lies.
It is a fact.
It is a fact.
It is a fact.
It is a fact. And, and I use that to say, in addition to all that, when we are talking about colonialism, you would look at any piece of legislation. Let us go from way back prior to universal adult suffrage. And I can give an example. There's one time I decided to look at the revised laws of St. Lucia. Revised as far down as 2013. And we have an act called the Money Lending Act. And are you aware that this is an act which came into operation in 1907 and has never been repealed?
Never.
Never. So therefore, all of these acts, if you look at all the...
Yes, from the colonial past. Yes.
And even up until presently, some time ago I was raising that with my colleagues. I'm looking at, for instance, we have now in operation in our courts what is called the Evidence Act. It's an act which governs evidence. You know where that act came from? That act came from New South Wales.
Can you imagine?
New South Wales. And the truth of the matter is, it has been creating a nightmare for us lawyers.
Wow.
And as I've indicated, you can only draft your legislation in consonance with your culture.
Yes, exactly.
You cannot go and pick up people's legislation, and that is one of the difficulties with most of the, look for instance, the Backing of Warrants Act. The Backing of Warrants Act is an old act that came out of Ireland sometime in 1930 something or 1940 something.
Time, yes.
You know, I mean, there is nothing updated. We do not, and even some of the drafts, and that is why that I even complain, in my view, my subjective view, that even when you look at, for instance, the COVID-19 Act, it seems to me to have been some kind of act which was taken out of somewhere and just brought here. Is it a copy and paste?
Copy and paste, that's what I see. It's a patched up
Yeah, it's
thing.
a patch put together.
Yes, and we have to come to that. But what I want to really, from what you are saying, therefore, when we talk about the rule of law, does that really apply here? Because I find it very difficult to understand that.
Well, when it comes to the rule of law, what they really mean is that to ensure that the law is such, and it emanates entirely out of the Constitution, for instance.
Exactly.
Like, for instance, we do not have it here, but you have the protection of the subject and the right to protection and so on and so forth. Now, the question of the right to protection under the Constitution is one which has been transformed, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, where the Constitution makes provisions for the due process.
Correct.
In other words, whatever is going to happen. And that was one of my complaints about the COVID-19 bill.
That's why I'm saying the rule of law.
Right.
And what you have brought in there, what you are saying there, infringes completely people's human rights.
Right. Now, that was an issue I also raised on the Backing of Warrants Act. Because in the Backing of Warrants Act, it's just a question of an affidavit. Somebody comes, unlike the Extradition Act, for instance. Now, there you have, and that is what creates the anomaly. There you have an Extradition Act on the one hand. It deals with extradition. In the schedule of the Extradition Act, it tells you most probably which countries are to which you can, and which countries can be added on.
Correct.
And then all of a sudden, and then you come and tell me, at the end of the day, you're passing a Backing of Warrants Act because it is quicker and it's more expeditious than it makes unacceptable in my view. So therefore, that is another thing we need. We need to have, in my view, draftsmen. Of course, you can have different pieces of statute and pieces of legislation, but we need to have draftsmen who can tailor cut those provisions to suit our own circumstance. We must never forget that any time that we have a constitution, in my view, my respectful view, is supposed to be a document that reflects the norms, the mores and values of our people. It is not supposed to reflect the values and mores of our colonial masters, and then we try to refine it as if, you know, that is all we know.
Or colonialism had a conscience.
Exactly.
No conscience at all.
Well, it certainly had no conscience in my view.
Conscience for us.
Yeah, in my view.
In my view also.
You know, and so these are the issues. But, you know, the funny thing, and I will say it time and again, it is important, in my view, other than all that, is that St. Lucians must be educated.
Correct.
By our politicians themselves to know what their rights are. To know that, you know, look, if we are going to do something, let me give an example. In 1979, why do you believe that there was this bigger You think that we did not want to be independent? But of course it was used as a political gimmick, not to obtain not to attain independence because of so. So would we have remained a British overseas territory for the rest of our lives? But there were certain politicians that got into the fray and said, no, we don't want independence, we do not want. But the problem is, but the difficulty is, and you know, some time ago I was in court and I raised that issue and the magistrate laughed. They said St. Lucia has attained 40 years of independence.
Really?
And the question that I asked was, independence of what?
What? Are we really independent?
Are we really independent? You know? And it goes to show a certain element, in my view, of, you know, always keeping the people at a certain level of ignorance and so on. You know? I mean, let me give an example. I recall some time ago, I was in Barbados. I think it was just the time when we had some kind of earthquake. And it was amazing that I went into a rum shop at the bottom of a place called Free Hill, which is at the bottom of the university. I went to see my old friends like Griner, fellow was a Calypsonian. And when I heard the guys, whilst they're drinking their alcohol, when I heard their conversations relating to the whole question of earthquakes and the movements of the stratosphere and so on, I was shocked.
Right. To hear
do you
that
think
level.
do you think you can get that kind of constructive conversation in our rum shops?
Exactly.
Practically impossible.
Exactly.
You understand? Because the thing about it that our people are not reading. Our people are not encouraged to read. How many of the people really seriously know about our history? Our history at least 40 years ago.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, and how many people really knew until Mikey Pilgrim, an ex-minister, was in a show with Yadi and gave the whole rundown.
Yes, I saw that. Yes.
How many people know
Yes.
of our history from 1961 coming down 64 with John Compton?
Exactly. Not many.
Do we have any annals? Do we have anything?
Not even those in government right now.
No, really no.
So let us hold that. We hold our second segment. This is so interesting. You in the diaspora in St. Lucia, just hold on. We will be back because you have to hear the last bit of our segment, which is so important to me, and I'm sure Mr. Alberton Richelieu. Welcome back. You in the diaspora in St. Lucia, I'm enjoying this so much because this is for me a highly intellectual discussion on what we have in St. Lucia and where we should be. Especially, we need to educate our young. As I said to my daughters today, you all have to read more. Educate yourself more because reading is so important. Look back because history is cause and effect. And if you can envisage that, you will see or make St. Lucia, you the younger ones, make St. Lucia a better place. Alberton, what I really want to come to you about, because that's why I ask you about the rule of law, because the rule of law has been infringed in giving the police certain rights and privileges, I put it that way, in the COVID-19 bill.
Oh, yes.
And consequently, I cannot believe that any country can accept, and I'm talking about any democratic country, can accept the infringement on human rights so blatantly.
Well, like even for instance in the powers of detention under the COVID bill, that is something that we have to be very, very careful about, especially when it comes to detention of people. And like I said some time ago, discussing the same matters, I do not think that people conceptualize and understand the distinction between a state of emergency and a public health emergency.
Correct.
That issue has to be ventilated so that people can understand. Detention of persons, that is a particular, that's an area where a person's right to liberty is at stake. And so therefore you must put in the proper mechanism and safeguards in place to ensure that that person is not falsely imprisoned. Let me give an example. And I know that you are pretty au courant with what I am going to speak about. In 1942, the House of Lords had to sit during a time of a state of emergency in relation to the detention of particular persons because it was some war in Europe between, and I think the Germans.
Yes, the Second World War. Yes.
When the House of Lords sat, usually they sit either as three lords, three law lords, or five law lords, depending on the significance, and in some certain instances, 7. In that case, called the case Liversidge and Anderson, in which the question of the detention under a state of emergency arose, the 6 law lords said that whenever you have a phrase in a statute which says reasonable cause to believe it could be interpreted to mean that it was the subjective assessment of the Secretary of State. There was one Lord who dissented, and he went on to say that people's rights are to be respected,
Exactly.
whether it is in a state of war or whether it is in a state of peace. And thereafter, that was supported by another Chief Justice of Australia. It was, I'm trying to remember his name, but his name is not coming off now. And he said, and you know the surprising thing? Since then, the dissenting judgment of Lord Atkins has become the law. You cannot have provisions of laws which would appear to be irrational, vague, and unreasonable, thinking that you can give the people rights subjectively at their own whims and fancies. And more so, at least we have to accept for what it is now, the fundamental rights and freedoms under our Constitution.
But it's not only that. You know, what I'm hitting at is we say we are part and parcel of the United Nations.
Oh, yes.
The United Nations came into being, you know, so as to put those rights after the Second World War, when rights of, say, for example, the Jews were so infringed and things of that sort. And you are telling me that we have become part and parcel of that when we became independent, when we were under Britain. But yet, you are telling me you pass a COVID bill, or you hasten to pass a COVID bill where you infringe on people's human rights. You also infringe on the Constitution because of the way it was done, you know. And yet that bill is there, and I'm saying that anyone overseas who look at this will see the faux pas, as I put it, that cannot be a bill.
That's right. But separate and apart from that, I'm a person, I try to be as objective as I can. Very objective.
Me too.
We must understand that COVID-19 is something, it's a pandemic. It makes everybody sick. And so therefore, it may very well mean that the government thought in their minds at the time that, look, let us try and pass something as quickly as possible to try to see how best we can try to curtail or contain the COVID-19. And so therefore, in their haste to do that. But there's one word of warning and word of caution. If at that point in time, yes, you might be well-intentioned because you think that you're trying to contain a bill, when the people ask for discussion, give it to them.
No, but
Give it to them.
Alberton, what I am saying is that Grenada thought of it, but they shelved it because in discussion they found it would not. Because right now, if you look at what they're saying now, it is because we are not under a state of emergency. We are in a COVID-19, which is not the same.
That is correct. But you see, the interesting thing about well, I suppose everything depends on the style of governance. It depends on the style of leadership. It depends on what you look at, whether you're looking at, and I'm very guarded in the words that I use, whether you are in a sort of I do not know if I want to call it that, a sort of what people called, or they want to call, a misconceptualization of it in any event. You're in a capitalist society, or whether you are in what is called a socialist society. Now, a lot of people seem to misunderstand the whole issue of a socialist approach to governance.
I know.
A lot of people seem to. What they fail to understand about a socialist approach to governance is exactly what democracy is crying out for. It is crying out for the people to be part and parcel of the decision-making process.
But don't you think, though, that in this case, as you put it there, people are those sorts of people are linking socialism with communism.
That is where they've made
and that's where they're wrong.
That is where they're making the mistake.
There is a big gap.
You see? And the thing about it is that it is almost impossible to jump around and say that because communism contemplates a utopian society.
Correct.
It is not what people are thinking. You hear people tell you that Castro, and so for instance, when I say that Castro is a man who I have the greatest admiration for, and for many reasons.
I do too.
You understand? Yeah. So they would say, oh, well, you know, he's communist and that sort of thing. But there is a fundamental difference. Like, for instance, in Guyana, Guyana has what is called the socialist cooperative kind of governance.
Correct.
But even Barbados. But, you know, I'll tell you what creates the problem. And I've always said that the politicians create the problem.
But of course they do.
Because, and like I said, it creates the recurring decimal. I do not know if anyone would want to agree with me. But you know, are you aware that there is no serious ideological clarity and define between the two parties?
None whatsoever. Because don't forget that political science I did at my on my first degree, and when we talk about ideology in that sense, you could see the ideology, say for example, of the Labour Party and then the Conservative Party.
That is correct.
There was an ideology, but what I see here, it's if there is any ideology, it's very thin.
Very, very thin.
And you cannot see it.
You can't see it.
You can't see it.
You see, so therefore, and that is what, and a lot of these, people are not aware. But these things are very troubling, you know. Very, very troubling. Because people must understand that at least, even say for instance in Barbados, you can see an ideological difference between the two parties.
Correct.
Even in, but in, for instance, in Guyana, in Guyana, what happened is that since they had the 1980 constitution in Guyana, you found that there, the ideological thing about cooperative socialism, whereas, for instance, Chedi Jagan was pushing the Marxist-Leninist position.
Or Burnham.
Or Burnham, for that matter. But Burnham seemed to have diluted it to the extent that it seemed to have been called cooperative socialism. But the whole concept of what ought to be is letting the people, and you see, educating the people. One of the things I think that we need to also have here, look at, for instance, I'm wondering how they're going to respond in this pandemic to the educational system.
Well, I have been asking that also.
That is the problem. Because the educational system was no better in times gone by. And now that we have pandemic, it means that people have to be more acquainted with the technological, so on. Would the children really have the time to sit down and read as we do?
But it's not only that. But some of the parents have the background to be able to help their children.
That is it.
I may be able to, and I thought of that only yesterday.
Yes.
And when I look at my son, and he has class Monday to Thursday because he's at Tapia, 9 to 12, but everything is going on, and he's at home. But he has his mum, probably, or myself to help him.
Yes.
But what about those that cannot help them?
Those who are not technologically savvy.
Or don't even have the equipment.
You see?
You know. So what happens now to those children? Are we saying the poorer children, the gap that is expands?
Exactly. That is, and for me, that's the other problem too. As Fidel Castro did, ensured that the working class was more involved in the democratic process.
And the educational system.
And one always asks themselves a simple question, and I've also asked myself, why is it that the United States was able to get all the way to Vietnam, which is on the other side of Europe, and they were unable to get into Cuba, which is right under the belly of in Miami.
The beast.
The belly of the beast.
Yes.
And it's because a lot of the Cuban people were very much conscious. Correct. They were politically and socially conscious of what was happening around them. But the United States of America would not like that.
Exactly.
They would not like it.
And Castro educated his people.
There's no room for exploitation.
Exactly.
So the Americans would not like that at all. Exactly. But unless and until we develop our own system, constitutionally, politically, and let us try to avoid, because the other thing about our system is that it gives a lot of room for political nepotism,
Nepotism and corruption.
corruption, and
Yeah.
authoritarianism.
But of course, but you can see it right now.
That is what's happening.
It's happening right now.
And you know, and there's
what,
always
what upsets me so much, not cutting you short, is the hacks who are not objective. You know, if something is wrong, say it's wrong.
it's wrong.
You know,
It's wrong.
There is a right and a wrong.
And you know,
Say it.
do you know that that was my problem? I had been labeled. Nobody knows where I really stand.
Exactly.
But like I told them, there's nowhere for me to stand but being me
Me, correct.
and being objective.
Exactly.
I mean, I do not have to please anybody. I have to stand up for what I think is
It's
right.
right.
That is what is important.
St. Lucia is more important than
I remember
us.
Labour parties labeling me UWP, labeling me
Label you-
because I have always taken an objective stand.
When they say I move, and I'm like the moving finger.
No, it's not the question
You know
of
what I
moving
mean?
finger.
I don't
It-
give a damn.
it is when you get-
because the point is what is right for the country, what is right for those to come.
That is
Are
a-
we building and developing something for our children.
Children.
and their children?
And
That
I
is
remembered
more
when I took issue with the backing of Warrants Act, I said to them I took that particular position because I would not want my children to say tomorrow, Daddy, you had the opportunity and you did nothing about it. That was my position.
And that is what it's all about.
Yeah.
We are here today. God has given us what He's given us, that little bit of intelligence to use, and we have to use it wisely.
We have to.
You know,
And that is where we are running into the thing. And I just wish, to be honest, I really wish that St. Lucians would be a little more open-minded.
Correct.
Stop being closed-minded.
yes.
Let us be open-minded. Sit down and listen. That is what the whole principle of rule of law and the rule of natural justice entails.
That's why I brought
Giving
all
one the
that up.
opportunity
It's
of being
important.
heard. And when you hear that, find out whether it is constructive or destructive. Once it is not being leveled at the other person personally, and that is one thing I do not believe in.
Right.
Once it is, if you believe it is constructive, see if you can take from it and see what you can harness. See what you could, to assist the welfare of society
And the development of
and the
country.
development of their own country.
Alberton, why the time has come so much. I hope that you in the diaspora has enjoyed it, and in St. Lucia. But time is upon us, and I wish I could continue that conversation because I think we could talk for about 4 hours non-stop.
Oh, yeah.
And for me, it is fundamental. And when those who are listening, please take in some of the things that we spoke about today because it is essential, because our lives matter. The lives of our children matter. The lives of their children matter. The development of this little pristine land we call St. Lucia matters. So I want to thank you very much, Alberton.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming because I know you're a busy man.
Yeah.
And thank you, St. Lucia, and you in the diaspora for listening to us. Goodbye until the next program.